Okay, let's unpack this. For months, we've tracked the lead up to December 9th, 2025, but now it's here.
It's here, and the digital world for millions of young people has just fundamentally changed.
We are diving deep today into Australia's groundbreaking, world-first nationwide ban on social media for anyone under the age of 16. The source material you shared with us is incredibly fresh.
It is. It reflects the immediate fallout, the technical glitches and the human reactions just days after this massive law actually went into effect.
This isn't just news, it feels more like an instantaneous, unprecedented regulatory experiment.
It really is.
It's affecting millions of families, and maybe more importantly, it's setting a global standard for how governments are trying to deal with this critical crisis of youth mental health in the digital age.
Great. What's genuinely fascinating here is the sheer scope and, like you said, the speed of this change.
Mhm.
So our mission today really is to unpack this pivotal moment. We need to get into the why, the science, the mental health crisis that drove this drastic prohibition.
And then the how.
And then the how. The complex and, as we're seeing, often flawed enforcement mechanisms. Specifically, these highly contentious age verification technologies that platforms have been legally, forced to adopt overnight.
And finally, the impact.
The immediate impact.
Yeah.
We're seeing intense reactions from the youth, conflicting reports from parents, and this sort of strategic compliance and criticism from the tech giants.
This is so much more than just blocking a few apps.
Oh, absolutely. It represents a major, expensive, and really data-driven shift in global digital policy.
And the stakes could not be higher, which I think is our first key takeaway here. The financial penalties platforms are facing for not complying are genuinely severe.
Yeah, we aren't talking about token fines.
No, we're talking figures up to 10% of their annual Australian revenue. Imagine the regulatory pressure that creates.
It's a white-hot incentive for immediate demonstrable compliance. It's something the tech world has, frankly, rarely ever faced before.
Exactly. And here's the tension, right? The thing that's going to define this deep dive.
The central conflict.
Despite that massive financial incentive, early reports, just days in, are already showing significant flaws.
Huge inconsistencies in the new age verification systems. We've seen technical difficulties, early failures. It's allowing really motivated underage users to maintain access.
So that's creating these immediate public loopholes.
Loopholes that the government and the platforms are now scrambling to close. And that conflict between the regulatory intent, the law, and the technical reality, the ability to bypass it, that's going to define the next few months of this experiment.
So for you, the listener, this is really the crux of the issue. Can technology effectively police itself when the motivation to subvert the rules is just so incredibly high?
That's the billion-dollar question.
So let's start at ground zero.
Yeah.
What exactly did the Australian government ban, and what was the legislative foundation for it?
The objective is remarkably clean, almost unambiguous. It's about protecting young people from the detrimental mental health effects and online dangers that have been explicitly linked to social media use. They defined the problem, and then they legislated what they see as the solution.
And this law, it passed with, what, bipartisan support?
Sweeping bipartisan support earlier this year. It's exceptionally broad and very stringent in how it's applied.
And critically, it shifts the blame.
It shifts the accountability entirely onto the platforms. The law says they have to proactively take reasonable steps to stop users under 16 from creating or even accessing accounts.
So reasonable steps is the key phrase there.
It is. This isn't some vague guideline. It's a legally enforced requirement built around a functional definition of what a social media service actually is.
And they're not just targeting content.
No, they're specifically targeting the mechanisms, the algorithmic feeds, the interactive loops, the things designed for large-scale, potentially harmful engagement.
And because that definition of a social media service matters so much, the government didn't just leave it open to interpretation. They gave a list.
A very targeted list. This wasn't a blanket ban on all digital communication. It was, as you said, more like a surgical strike.
Against the platforms they deemed most dangerous, based on those core functions.
Exactly.
So let's lay out the full roster. What are the 10 major platforms that are affected?
The list really reads like a who's who of the current digital hierarchy, the networks that just dominate youth culture globally.
Okay.
You've got Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, X, what used to be Twitter, Snapchat, Reddit, Discord, Twitch, Pinterest, and Telegram.
That is the full list of 10.
That's the full 10. And they must now establish and, just as importantly, rigorously maintain demonstrably effective age verification procedures.
Or face those devastating financial penalties we mentioned.
Exactly. The sheer size and the diversity of this list really underscores how ambitious the Australian government's attempt is here.
We have to pause and really understand why these 10 specifically. What criteria landed them on this list while, other seemingly similar platforms were spared?
So the government defined social media services based on a kind of cocktail of characteristics they deemed particularly harmful to the developing adolescent mind.
A toxic cocktail, it sounds like.
It is. These platforms all share three elements. First, they facilitate large-scale, non-personal follower systems, which opens users up to comparison and viral harm from total strangers.
Right.
Second, they involve interaction with vast amounts of user-created content that's delivered algorithmically.
Which can push harmful material.
Precisely. It can be tailored to exploit their insecurities or their emotional state. And third, they enable that immediate reactive communication, comments, DMs, other real-time interactive elements, which is basically fuel for cyberbullying and these instant feedback loops.
So it's that combination public reach, addictive algorithms, and instant interaction that triggers the ban.
That's the trigger. And on top of that, the platforms are required to submit granular, regular reports to Digital Safety Australia and undergo these, periodic, unannounced audits to make sure their verification systems aren't degrading over time.
But, as always, the complexity is in the details. We need to clarify the important exemptions and the partial bans. What digital spaces are explicitly not included?
Lawmakers were very specific here. They wanted to avoid regulating private, direct, one-to-one communication.
Things they saw as essential for daily life.
Yes. So private messaging services like WhatsApp, Signal, and just traditional SMS text messaging are entirely exempt.
And the reasoning there is pretty straightforward.
It is. The reasoning is sound. These platforms primarily focus on communication between people who already know each other. That dramatically lowers the risk profile compared to anonymous interactions and algorithmic exposure.
So it's functional communication versus open-ended social engagement.
That's a perfect way to put it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about gaming? So many gaming platforms are incredibly social. They have voice chat, streaming, friend lists. They look functionally very similar to the banned services.
And that is precisely the regulatory challenge they acknowledged, but decided to approach cautiously.
So for now, they're safe.
For now. Standalone gaming services like the Xbox Network and PlayStation Network are currently exempt from the ban.
But with a big asterisk.
A very big one. The legislation makes it clear that social features within games, things like large public in-game chats, community forums, or content-sharing features that closely mimic the banned platforms, are explicitly flagged for potential future regulation.
So they're taking it one step at a time.
It shows their approach is methodical. Tackle the big social media networks first, and then, if data warrants it, expand the mandate to the social elements of gaming.
Okay, let's address the most complex case of all, YouTube. It's not totally banned, but it's heavily restricted. It creates a very, very nuanced scenario for young users and their parents.
It creates a massive gray area. For Australian users under 16, the viewing functions on YouTube are allowed without needing age verification.
So they can watch educational videos, music videos, things like that.
Right. They can access content for informational and entertainment purposes. However, and this is the key, the social and participatory aspects are completely restricted.
Meaning no commenting.
No commenting on videos, no uploading their own content, and they cannot create accounts that facilitate personalized interaction like liking or subscribing.
So it's a classic regulatory attempt to strike a balance.
It is. They're trying to preserve the platform's informational benefits while surgically excising the interactive, potentially damaging social elements that fuel comparison and digital anxiety.
And lastly, what about platforms that are primarily educational? Any specific provisions for tools like Google Classroom?
Absolutely. They had to account for that to avoid disrupting schooling. The ban explicitly exempts platforms designated exclusively for educational purposes, Google Classroom being the prime example.
And what about multi-use platforms like Pinterest?
There are provisions for those too. The source material noted Pinterest's specific classroom resource features, which remain accessible. It ensures educators can continue to leverage digital tools. The intent is consistent throughout. Safeguard learning and communication between known parties, while strictly restricting open-ended algorithmic social exposure to the world at large.
And that transition brings us to the absolute core of why this law was even passed. The rationale. This wasn't a policy driven by anecdote or political whim.
No, not at all. It was a policy driven by terrifying data reflecting a clear mental health crisis among young Australians.
So what was the government's central overarching motivation for enacting such a drastic world-first prohibition?
The motivation was a direct and, frankly, an unavoidable response to a statistical catastrophe.
A catastrophe.
The government established what they saw as an irrefutable correlation. A dramatic increase in social media use among minors that correlated almost perfectly with a severe spike in depression, anxiety, and self-harm among teenagers.
So the consensus among lawmakers was that the old ways weren't working.
All right, fiddling with content controls was failing a generation, and they felt only a wholesale prohibition could arrest these worsening mental health outcomes.
And there was a specific data point that really pushed this over the line, wasn't there?
There was. The legislative tipping point was the finding from government studies that showed a staggering 67% increase in the use of youth mental health services over the last decade.
Which aligns perfectly with the rise of social media.
Precisely with the decade of exponential social media engagement within that demographic.
That 67% increase, I mean, that's a public health crisis indicator you just can't dismiss.
You can't. It suggests the system was completely overwhelmed by a tidal wave of new mental health needs that coincided with the saturation of these platforms.
So this ban, it really rests on a scientific bedrock. Let's get into the foundation of this law, the extensive, detailed longitudinal studies that provided that scientific justification.
The entire policy stands on the findings of extensive research from the Digital Safety Commission over a rigorous 3-year period.
This wasn't just a quick poll.
No, this was a longitudinal study that meticulously followed over 10,000 Australian children aged 8 to 16. They tracked their mental health indicators, their academic performance, and critically, their exact social media usage patterns over time.
And that sample size, that duration, it provides a very robust correlation.
So robust that it became essentially undeniable evidence in the eyes of the parliamentary committee.
And the headline findings from that research are truly damning. They illustrate the measurable negative impact of early access on developing minds.
They do.
What were the specific statistics that really cemented the case for prohibition?
The research established a devastating link between early exposure and serious psychological distress. The headline statistic was this: children who started using social media before age 14 were found to be 42% more likely to suffer from diagnosed anxiety disorders compared to their peers who started later.
42%, that's a huge number.
It's massive, but it didn't stop there. Those same early starters also experienced a 39% increase in sleep disturbances.
Which is another key indicator.
It is. When legislators see documented evidence showing nearly half of early adopters face severe anxiety, coupled with significant sleep loss, which we know fundamentally impairs emotional regulation, memory, cognitive function, the argument for simply blocking access becomes overwhelmingly strong.
And this is where it gets deeply analytical. The government didn't just cite correlations. They brought in child psychologists, neuroscientists, to explain the mechanism driving these effects.
Yes, they wanted to understand how these platforms were exploiting the vulnerability of the young brain.
So let's unpack that addiction and development angle.
The experts focused heavily on the intentional design features of social media, describing them as highly sophisticated behavioral conditioning tools.
Not just entertainment.
No, conditioning tools. They explained that adolescent brains are in this crucial, highly plastic phase. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, understanding consequences, it isn't fully developed until your mid-20s.
But the reward center is.
The limbic system, the reward center, is fully operational and highly sensitive to external stimuli.
So we have an underdeveloped braking system paired with an accelerator that's just stuck to the floor.
That's a perfect analogy. The systems that fuel addiction, the infinite scrolling, the variable and unpredictable delivery of likes or notifications, which is a classic conditioning mechanism, they all target that highly sensitive adolescent reward center.
Creating a powerful feedback loop.
A dopamine-driven feedback loop. Child psychologists explicitly compared the resulting behavior patterns, the compulsive checking, the withdrawal symptoms, the need for constantly escalating engagement, to those you see in substance use disorders.
And that comparison to substance use disorders, that's what justified the severity of the policy. Prohibition, not just moderation.
It absolutely is. Beyond the general addictive mechanisms, the specific issue of body image and comparison, particularly for teenage girls, was another major scientific pillar for this.
A critical, separate focus.
It was. The research highlighted the body image concern as a particularly severe and targeted side effect. Teenage girls exposed to that constant stream of filtered, edited, curated perfection on platforms like Instagram show significantly higher rates of clinical eating disorders and profoundly negative self-perception.
Often leading to body dysmorphia.
Yes. That constant algorithmic comparison drives psychological outcomes that, according to the evidence, required immediate protective action.
So before this ban, Australia tried other things, right? They had regulatory efforts in place. Let's briefly cover those earlier attempts, like the Online Safety Act.
Right. From 2020 through 2024, Australia did try to use less restrictive, content-focused frameworks. The Online Safety Act was the main one.
And that was about regulating the output.
Exactly. It required platforms to remove harmful content, like severe cyberbullying or illegal material, usually within a 24-hour window. The intention was to regulate the content without restricting access.
And why did that fail to move the needle on youth mental health?
Because regulating the content didn't address the systemic harm caused by the architecture of the platforms themselves.
So even when platforms complied, the problem didn't go away.
The youth mental health outcomes just continued their worrying downward trajectory. The definitive proof of failure came from the eSafety Commissioner's 2024 report.
What did that find?
It found that even with the law in place, only 63% of platforms were achieving full compliance. And worse, many were just implementing superficial safety features that tech-savvy kids could easily bypass.
So lawmakers reached a conclusion.
They concluded that the industry was fundamentally incapable or maybe unwilling to prioritize health over engagement. That meant surface-level safety features were politically, practically, and morally insufficient. Prohibition, however radical, became the logical next step.
So now we shift from the intent to the execution. A world-first law is only as effective as its enforcement. Let's clarify the regulatory structure. Where does the legal responsibility fall?
The legal framework is intentionally punitive toward the platforms. The law places the onus entirely on the social media companies.
They have to prove they've taken reasonable steps.
Exactly. And that's crucial because it makes platform failure legally and financially actionable. If a child gets through, the platform is liable, not the parent, not the child.
And the regulatory body is doing the actual heavy lifting.
There are two primary enforcement bodies. Digital Safety Australia, or DSA, provides the high-level oversight and policy direction.
And then there's ACMA.
The Australian Communications and Media Authority, ACMA, is tasked with the gritty technical policing. They're the ones running continuous technical testing, essentially acting like white hat hackers.
So they're actively trying to break the systems.
They're using fake underage accounts to see if they can bypass the verification. They also review the quarterly compliance reports and carry out regular surprise audits to pinpoint any weaknesses.
And that definition of reasonable steps is expected to be a continuously rising technical bar.
Enforced by ACMA, yes.
That rising bar is made possible because of those colossal financial consequences. So outline the specific graduated penalty system for us.
The system is designed for escalation and maximum impact. Initial infractions lead to formal warnings.
And if they don't listen?
Persistent or severe noncompliance triggers enforceable undertakings, which are legally binding agreements demanding specific, costly improvements to their systems.
And the ultimate deterrent?
The ultimate deterrent is the maximum financial penalty, up to AU $50 million or 10% of the platform's annual Australian turnover, whichever is greater.
10% of turnover. For a company like Meta or TikTok, that is a massive quarterly hit.
It's a hit no CFO can afford to ignore. It creates the necessary intense pressure to comply immediately.
And if all those financial deterrents fail, the government reserves the nuclear option, correct?
Absolutely. The government reserves the right to issue a full nationwide block on access to any platform that repeatedly fails to comply.
That seems like a last resort.
It's drastic and unlikely since it would cut off a major service from a significant market. But the threat remains a powerful signal that compliance is non-negotiable.
Okay, let's turn to the technology itself. Compliance hinges entirely on age verification, forcing platforms to adopt these diverse, sometimes intrusive technologies. What methods are we seeing?
It's a real patchwork approach because no single method is foolproof or perfectly privacy-friendly.
Right.
TikTok, for instance, implemented a visual age estimation system. It uses algorithms to scan user faces, analyzing facial geometry to try and estimate if the user is over 16.
And what about Meta?
Meta, so Facebook and Instagram are using a dual-pronged system. They accept traditional ID verification, but they also rely heavily on social vouching.
Social vouching, what's that?
It's where existing adult connections on the network have to vouch for the user's age, creating a kind of social trust graph.
Interesting. And others?
Other platforms, like Discord, are relying on partnerships with third-party verification services that cross-reference user data with external government or banking records to confirm age off-site.
Let's focus on the deep flaws that are already emerging, especially with that visual age estimation tech. The source material highlights massive inconsistencies.
Oh, the immediate implementation has exposed significant weaknesses that kids are already exploiting.
How so?
The visual estimation technologies have proven highly inconsistent and susceptible to bias. Tests showed children as young as 12 were wrongly identified as being 18 or older, instantly granting them full access.
So it's not just a regulatory failure, it's a known systemic issue with the tech.
It is. It highlights algorithmic bias, where these systems often miscategorize faces based on lighting, camera quality, or even perceived racial features. It leads to false positives that undermine the entire ban.
And what about the platform-specific workarounds that these highly motivated, tech-savvy teens are exploiting right now?
We have clear examples of low-tech workarounds defeating high-tech enforcement.
Brilliant.
TikTok's visual estimation system is vulnerable to environmental manipulation. Users learn that if you try multiple scans under different lighting conditions or with subtle changes in camera angle, you can eventually get an age estimation over 16.
Wow. And Discord.
On Discord, the restriction primarily hits the mobile app. Users quickly realize that server access remains fully possible through standard web browsers, which lack the same integrated biometric checks.
And the simplest bypasses are often the most successful, proving that the platforms haven't closed basic loopholes.
Exactly. On platforms like Reddit, verification can be entirely circumvented just by creating a new account with a different email address and a fake birth date.
It suggests they've prioritized the most visible compliance measures.
Like the facial scan, yes, but they've failed to implement deeper security, like device fingerprinting or IP tracking, which would flag repeated attempts to create false accounts from the same device.
Finally, let's cover the account deletion procedures for users who are flagged as underage. Is it just an immediate purge?
No, the government mandated a clear, structured protocol. When an account is flagged, the user gets a notification with instructions on how to appeal. Parents get separate notifications.
And there's the grace period.
A generous 30-day grace period. During that month, the user's content and connections are held in stasis before permanent deletion.
Which is vital for people wrongly flagged.
It is. It gives them the necessary time to appeal, submit verified ID, and recover their digital presence.
This law is a massive, immediate societal experiment, and the public reaction, especially from the kids at Targets, has been seismic.
Yeah, we're seeing frustration, sophisticated defiance, and a huge pushback from Australian teenagers. The youth response really demonstrates that the fundamental need for social connection is just overriding the fear of regulation.
Then we have data to back that up.
We do. According to DigiWatch, a social media monitoring firm, mentions of VPN services among Australian teen users just exploded.
That was the number.
A staggering 780% increase in the single week following the ban.
780%.
That immense surge clearly indicates that a majority of displaced teenagers are actively and successfully seeking technical workarounds to tunnel under the restrictions and reestablish their digital lives.
That jump isn't just a statistic. It's an indictment of the Prohibition model's underlying assumption. If you remove the tool, you don't remove the need.
Exactly.
So what are the implications of pushing kids to use VPNs?
That is the critical analytical point. Prohibition, in this case, doesn't eliminate risk. It just shifts it into less regulated, less visible territory.
They're using free, less secure services.
Right, which can expose them to malware, data harvesting, and push them toward the darker corners of the internet where enforcement is virtually impossible. The policy tries to protect them from algorithmic harm, but inadvertently exposes them to greater technical and privacy risks.
And the defiance isn't just technical, it's social. Surveys are backing up this feeling of digital isolation.
They absolutely are. A large-scale survey of 2,000 teenagers by Youth Digital Voice revealed that 67% of them disagreed with the ban.
And what was their primary concern?
It wasn't just annoyance, it was genuine digital isolation and the loss of international connections.
Like the story of Sophia.
Yeah, the anecdote of 15-year-old Sophia from Perth. She highlighted the unintended consequence. She could no longer communicate easily with her cousins overseas because they relied on Instagram for their daily connection. For these kids, the ban amputated vital social links.
So they aren't just lying down and accepting it. How are they engaging with the policy beyond just finding workarounds?
They're showing a real degree of political maturity and creativity. Many teenagers feel the total ban belittles their ability to manage risk. They argue they should have been given regulated, graduated access.
Not treated as a homogenous block until age 16.
Precisely. We saw peaceful, organized protests across major Australian cities. Teenagers marched with highly articulate signs.
Signs like education, not elimination.
And the very pointed slogan, "Teach us to navigate, not to avoid." It shows a generation rejecting the government's protective paternalism in favor of education and self-determination.
And in terms of practical adaptation, they're reverting to older, allowed technologies.
Exactly. To maintain those peer connections, they're strategically reverting to older, non-banned tech. We're seeing a surge in sophisticated group messaging on Signal and WhatsApp, which are exempt, and even organized email chains.
Shifting to the adults now. The public opinion among parents and educators is visibly split.
It is. Parentline Australia's data shows a clear schism. 58% of parents are in favor of the ban, while 34% are actively against it.
So let's analyze the perspective of the pro-ban parents. What immediate benefits are they reporting?
These parents often describe a sense of immediate relief. They're no longer fighting the constant draining battles over screen time.
I can imagine.
They've reported tangible improvements in family life, better sleep patterns in their children, and more meaningful family interaction. For this group, the government has basically provided the external discipline they felt unable to enforce.
Conversely, what are the primary anxieties of the anti-ban parents?
Their anxiety centers on preparedness and literacy. They worry that by cutting off access until 16, their children are falling critically behind in developing essential digital literacy skills.
Skills they'll need for jobs, education.
Exactly. They also report significant social distress, noting their children feel isolated, particularly those who are already shy and relied on digital interaction as a safe social outlet.
And these contrasting effects are playing out in real time in the classroom.
Yes. Teachers are reporting a bifurcated outcome. Some schools have seen immediate positive effects, like better classroom focus and less mobile phone distraction.
But others?
Other schools report a noticeable increase in anxiety and social tension among students who saw their primary social safety net just vanish overnight. It shows the ban's effect is not uniform. It hits socially vulnerable children particularly hard.
Finally, let's turn to the corporate giants. They face huge penalties, yet they've maintained a high-profile philosophical opposition. How have they responded?
They're walking a very tightrope between compliance and critique.
Take Meta.
Meta, in its official statement, accepted the need to comply but strongly advocated for a less prohibitive approach. They argued that education and graduated access would better serve young Australians than outright prohibition.
And TikTok was even more direct.
TikTok issued a more pointed critique, arguing the ban deprives young Australians of creative expression and vital connection while simultaneously pushing them toward unregulated alternatives.
Which is their core defensive argument.
It is that the regulatory friction forces users into hidden channels where both the platforms and the government lose all visibility, making kids less safe.
It sounds like they're already positioning themselves for a future where Australia might soften the prohibition.
They are absolutely looking ahead. We're seeing a number of platforms introducing what they call safety waiting rooms for the Australian market.
Safety waiting rooms?
Yeah, they're digital spaces where users who try to sign up under 16 are offered limited, highly moderated, non-interactive content.
It's a strategic move.
It serves a dual purpose. It's a public demonstration of an attempt to offer age-appropriate content. But more importantly, it positions them as ready for a potential graduated access model should the government decide to ease the total ban in the future.
So Australia has volunteered to be the world's test case for this. The government has signaled that this isn't permanent, but a massive intervention. What is the plan for assessing if this experiment actually works?
The government has already pledged a thorough, evidence-based assessment after exactly 1 year of enforcement.
And that will be rigorous.
It will be. Drawing on data from multiple sources, trends in youth mental health service use, tracking digital literacy, and scrutinizing all the enforcement difficulties reported by ACMA.
And they'll look at the unexpected social outcomes, too.
The isolation, the defiance, the use of VPNs, both the positive and the negative.
And the readiness to pivot is essential. especially given that immediate defiance from teenagers. What potential next steps are on the table?
Officials have been clear they are ready to modify the strategy based on the evidence, not dogma. If mental health outcomes improve, the ban will likely be sustained and verification requirements strengthened.
But if the data shows significant negative outcomes,
Like widespread isolation or a permanent shift into unregulated spaces, they are prepared to consider models of graduated access.
maybe allowing limited rights as kids get closer to 16.
Exactly. Digital Safety Australia isn't waiting, though. They are already beefing up technical verification requirements in response to the initial loopholes and speeding up funding for digital literacy programs in schools.
So since this is a world first, the global regulatory community is watching very closely. What countries are actively considering similar regulations?
The global tech industry is watching nervously because Australia's model, if it's seen as a success, could immediately become the blueprint for worldwide regulation.
So who's first in line?
Well, New Zealand, as a close neighbor, has publicly committed to studying Australia's implementation closely.
And the UK?
The most advanced movement is in the United Kingdom. They're drafting legislation proposing a minimum age of 14, coupled with a strict graduated access model between 14 and 16 that requires mandatory parental approval.
What about continental Europe? Are the approaches different there?
They are. France has already introduced a minimum digital age of 13, but crucially, it requires mandatory parental controls and consent until the child turns 15. It's a consent-based model, not a prohibition.
And Germany?
Germany is exploring an even softer route, a purely consent-based model, focusing enforcement on parental oversight rather than technical platform restriction. It shows a whole spectrum of approaches, but all are predicated on learning from Australia's radical decision.
Let's connect the enforcement mechanisms, specifically the reliance on biometric and ID verification, to the broader global regulatory debate. You touched on privacy earlier.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most profound global implication of the ban.
How so?
To comply, platforms are forced to deploy these highly advanced technologies like visual age estimation, which involve gathering and analyzing sensitive biometric data. These methods raise major privacy and civil liberties concerns.
And we're talking about algorithms that have historically shown bias.
Exactly. We know from controversies like the UK police use of facial recognition that these systems can be highly biased. They disproportionately misidentify people of color or specific demographic groups.
So Australia has effectively made its minors a forced testing ground for controversial surveillance tech.
In a way, yes. The debate now is, are we trading one form of systemic harm algorithmic addiction for another? The erosion of privacy and potentially biased biometric identification requirements for digital access. The international community is watching how Australia manages the ethical fallout of using these tools.
Before we close, let's address the listener directly. Let's give some practical advice for Australian families trying to navigate this immediate chaotic transition.
Okay. First question is always about communication. So we must reiterate that messaging apps like WhatsApp, Signal, and SMS are still fully allowed.
DMs within the banned platforms are not.
Correct. Direct messaging features within Instagram or Snapchat are restricted because they are an integral part of the banned service.
And what steps should a parent take if they discover, despite the ban, their child has found a loophole and is still accessing a banned platform?
First, because the law places the burden on the platform, the parent's immediate action should be to report the verification failure directly to the platform's help center. Give them all the details.
Force them to address the flaw.
Exactly. If the platform fails to respond within 48 hours, you should then escalate the report to the eSafety Commissioner's office through their dedicated portal.
And beyond reporting.
Beyond reporting, you should focus on managing the child's underlying need for connection. The government's Digital Parents Resource Hub offers specific guides for conversation and suggestions for offline or non-banned digital activities.
And finally, a quick confirmation on the complex YouTube status. Is all educational use banned for under-16s?
No. Educational use of YouTube is still permitted, but under specific controlled conditions. Schools can continue to use it as an instructional tool when content is shown by teachers through official school accounts.
But individual accounts are still a no-go.
Correct. The strict rule remains for individual users under 16. They are still restricted from having personal accounts, commenting, liking, or uploading content.
We have dissected the layers of this world-first policy. Australia has committed to total prohibition, choosing to interrupt the flow of digital life based on hard scientific evidence of harm.
rather than continuing with the failed, gradual approach of self-regulation and content education.
The immediate disruption is undeniable defiant teenagers, stressed parents, massive regulatory upheaval. But the stated goal is monumental: the tangible improvement of youth mental health outcomes across an entire generation.
It's a truly remarkable moment in regulatory history. A major developed nation has decided that public health takes absolute precedence over digital access and market freedom. The world, and especially the global tech industry, is fixed on Australia, just waiting for that one-year evaluation.
Which leaves us with the ultimate provocative question that every nation considering this path from London to Paris to Wellington must grapple with as they study Australia's progress.
Will this radical attempt at limiting social media access successfully deliver the intended benefit of improved youth mental health outcomes by age 16? Or will the friction and forced ingenuity of prohibition simply push highly motivated young users into the shadows onto low-security VPNs and unregulated, non-audited corners of the internet, where the risks of harm, exploitation, and exposure might actually be harder for both regulators and parents to monitor and mitigate? That is the essential, profound balancing act that Australia is testing for the rest of the world to learn from.